Hey guys, today I'm going to talk to you about how to cut out the background pieces for Group B of English Garden. Now we're starting with 4 pieces of fabric that are each cut in 24-inch strips. So they're 24 inches by the width of the fabric. And so I have all 4 of these stacked together. But the first thing I did before I stacked these is I pressed them really, really well, which you guys know for me is something I don't do often. However, for this particular case, we are about to cut fabric using T-templates, which are those traditional templates that are cut to the exact size that we need them to fit into the quilt. So you want to start with everything as flat as possible for that. The other thing is that these large rectangular template sheets that we're going to be placing on this fabric, it's kind of a tight fit. So you want to make sure everything's nice and flat and pressed out so that you have as much space to work on it as possible. So I've stacked the 4 pieces together, and I got this corner, which is kind of my bottom left corner, the corner closest to me, as perfectly aligned as I could, and I went ahead and put a pin here. Once I did that, I kind of pressed everything with my hands, kind of smoothed it out, going away from this spot and making sure that I keep this as aligned as possible. This is where I'm going to place my templates from. So if there's anything funny happening with something being a little bigger or smaller than the other strips, that's happening at the top, and we should have a little extra wiggle room at the top if I'm placing starting here. So once I've got my fabric all nice and flat and aligned as good as I possibly can along this edge, all 4 pieces, I'm going to place those big rectangular template layouts on the fabric. So let me do that, and then I will come back to you and show you the result of that. Okay, so I've got these big rectangles laid out on the sheet. Notice that I'm pretty close to this selvage here, and I gave myself about 1/8 of an inch of room down here at the bottom. Remember, I've got this as aligned as I possibly can, so this 1/8 of an inch, and then I got a little extra there before I actually get to my template. And then as I look up here, I have a little bit, maybe about 1/4 of an inch before I get to this T template. Remember that T templates are the templates that are going to be cut exactly. Notice that they don't have any dashed lines. So this one is not a T template, it's just a regular template. It's got our sewing line, our seam allowance line, and then some extra fluff in here. It's an oversized template, but T templates are not oversized at all. So this is TP 414, or the vast majority of it. We did cut a little bit of that off for last time. So here is the center where I'm putting the other side, kind of the mirror image template, and I've got those butted right up against each other. There is a little bit of space between the templates, but I've got the sheets butted up against each other, because when we look at this other end, let me shift this over, you will see that I'm also pretty close to the selvage over here. And I've got just a little bit of wiggle room again, right in here. Sorry, trying to keep you in the screen. Right in here. So I really do have plenty of room. So my next thing, now that I've seen that these fit, oh, and let me show you the top here, because the top does have a little extra space. Remember, I had about 1/8 of an inch at the bottom. Here at the top, I've probably got closer to 1/4 of an inch, but notice that my edges are not all even. Some of them are a little bigger or smaller, and so that's why I gave it a little extra room along that top edge. Okay, I have not glued these down yet, so that's the next thing that I'm going to do is glue these down, and then I'll come back to you and show you the next steps. Okay, so now what I've done is I have glued on the back side of these large rectangles. Because they are so big, what I did is I went around the perimeter and then did a grid of about every 3 or 4 inches each direction to make sure that I had glue that's going to be captured on every single piece. Again, notice that I've got these butted up against here. I have 1/8 of an inch or maybe slightly more here, and then down at the selvage edges. I've got a little bit of extra space, but not a whole lot here and here. Okay, so by gluing this down, and oh, by the way, I also pressed these so that they are nice and flat as well. And I don't normally do that unless there's just really super bad creases, but when we're starting to work with T-templates, we want to be sure everything is flat. So I did press the papers as well. Turn those over on the back side so that you don't accidentally get glue, or sorry, so that you don't accidentally get your ink on your iron. And be sure and do that before you put the glue on. So the fabric and this first piece of paper, my top piece of fabric is nice and well adhered to the paper. However, I've got 3 other pieces underneath there, and the likelihood of those shifting as I start to cut is very high. So what I want to do is just go ahead and come in, and on some of the larger pieces I may place 2 or 3 pins, and on some of the smaller ones I might only do 1, but I want to go ahead and pin all of the templates through all 4 layers of fabric to make sure that the shifting is kept to a minimum as we start to do our cutting. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll show you what that looks like when I come back. Okay, so I'm finishing up with my pinning here. I have just a couple more to do. And again, all I'm doing is just wanting to hold those layers of fabric together. I did decide it was probably best practice, even on some of these smaller ones, to go ahead and get at least 2 pins in. That way they're not trying to twist the pieces of fabric as we're cutting. So I am going to go ahead and put 2 pins even in some of these small ones. And we're just kind of making sure that everything is laying flat as I put those pins in. I don't want to get it all bunched up and wrinkled and everything. So some of these larger pieces have 3, or even these big triangles, I went ahead and put 4 in those so that we make sure that we have plenty of places to get it stabilized. So now we're really just going to cut all of this out similarly to what we've done in the past. The one thing that we want to be mindful of is the T-templates. The T-templates don't have wiggle room. They don't have these dashed lines and then extra space. So we're going to be cutting as close to right on the line as possible. So I would recommend that you start by cutting this in half along the line between the 2 templates, and then maybe get some of these larger pieces cut out first. My recommendation would be to use your rotary cutter and make sure you have a sharp blade, because you are cutting through 4 layers of fabric here, and be sure that you're using your ruler, of course, with that as well. So most of the T-templates that were cut were all straight lines, so that's pretty straightforward. You just use your ruler and your rotary cutter and you cut those. But there are a couple of these on each of the template sheets that have this curve. So I've already cut the straight edges, but I wanted to show you a couple of ways that I've tried cutting the curve, and you can do what works best for you. So the first way that I'm going to do is to use my curved ruler and a smaller rotary cutter than normal. I normally use a 60mm, but I've switched to my 45 just so that I can make that tighter curve a little easier. So remember that you can just look for the 1/4 inch line on your curved ruler, and you line that up with the inside solid line. And so you're only going to be able to cut with this ruler maybe about 1 inch before this line deviates off of that solid line. And so when I get to that point, I'm going to shift and then cut a little bit more, shift, cut more, shift, cut more, until I've got the whole thing done. So let's take a look at that. So you just want to take your time, go as slow as you need to, stopping and shifting whenever it needs to be aligned again. And sorry, I'm kind of blocking your view with my hand here, but I think you kind of get the idea. All right, and so that is one way. I also decided to try scissors. These are small enough pieces that they're probably fairly easy to handle with scissors, and you can just cut that. Remember that you're cutting 4 pieces of fabric, but as long as your scissors are sharp, these are those micro serrated ones, so they keep pretty sharp. And this does seem to work fine as well on a small piece like this. You may not want to try to use scissors on a great big long piece unless you've pinned it really, really well. But for something this size, it seems to be working just fine. So a couple of different ways to handle curves. You could also do it freehand, which is probably the way I would prefer to do it, but I know that that makes a lot of people nervous. So you do what you're comfortable with. The main thing is just get the job done.